that on our side, generally younger people leading the social movements look like Emma Watson, He movements, or Greta Thunberg with the environmentalist movement, or Malara with the Pakistan movement. We think that generally they will be the face of the movement in itself, and we don't think that they'll literally be kids. We think that generally they'll be younger generation, and usually maybe 10s to 30s, and we think the range is pretty wide, just generally younger generations. But second, we think that veterans will not be excluded from the movement and they will still remain and provide resources. There are 3 reasons as to why this will happen. A, we think that generally younger people in the movement in general has the incentive to access benefits and experiences, right? So we don't think that they will necessarily exclude the veterans from these kind of movements because they know that they need the experiences and they need the resources that the veterans will provide. But B, we think that similar ideologies still exist within these groups anyways. Just because younger generation join does not necessarily mean an environmentalist movement is no longer going to be an environmentalist movement. And we think that they still have the ability to align in their interests, to have similar incentives in order to keep a movement going. But C, we think that there will be some degree of influence, and therefore they will remain in the movement likely, right? So what this means is that we think that by veterans having been participating in the movement for so long, they have the incentive to want to continue remaining in the group because they want to definitely see this group and social movement achieve something, right? So even if they're not the face of the movement, we think that they care about the cause. So there is the most incentive to contribute to whatever that they want to solve in the end. But we also think that likely this group will be balanced, right? So what we seek for is not one group being predominantly dominant because we think that younger generation and veterans will still have equal place to speak and will still have an equal amount to contribute. We don't have to defend entirely younger generations being predominating the group. We just have to defend that there is a rise in how younger people have been participating in social movements. But we also think that first, veterans already have, and usually first, the social movement in itself already has a voter base, so we don't think that they will exclude veterans. But also, there are also a limited number of veterans and younger generation, so we don't think that there will be unlimited amount of people who will continuously join in, and unlimited amount of veterans that will be leaving or joining in anyways. But finally, I think generally younger generation have a lot of intellectual property. So this means that they're not smart enough to know that if they were to defend the entire conventional movement in itself, they know that a lot of people won't opt in anyways. Moving on to the 2 arguments. First, we think that popular support will increase. The thesis of this argument is that more participants with younger faces will create relatability. 2 reasons as to why this will happen. A, there's a sense of familiarity with unique experiences. This is because of social awareness and shifting social norms and behaviors in the society. So for example, online cyberbullying, things like that are what is created by the social awareness and the shifting of social norms that is able to only be spoken by younger generation. We also think that B, media is more likely going to broadcast you if younger generations are going to be the face of the social movement. This is because compared to traditional media, we think younger people just participate in emerging media more, right? So we think that favoritism towards more relatability content and more audience who will be watching on emergence media will definitely make the media coverage more. And ultimately, we think that by doing that, we will be able to reach to the most least privileged groups who have been historically unable to access to these kind of social movements because of barricaded by the cost of entry. And my second speaker will extend upon that. But we also think that we're more unique in general, right? Because by having shock factors such as Greta Thunberg being the face of the environmentalist movement, we're able to garner the amount of support and relatability that is only able to be marketed on our side. But see, why is this important? 3 reasons. First, we need innovation, right? We need social movements to have younger faces and relatability and to have more media coverage and just in general. We think that there's no delta when you never change when social movements have not been changed historically. We think that the counterfactual has no additional benefit because if older people are the faces, younger people won't join anyways. This is what is likely going to happen in the counterfactual because you have less open ability and older generation do look just white privileged men preoccupying social movements. It looks we think that generally people will be reluctant to opt in because they think that older men are the people and the faces speaking for the movement. We think that but secondly we think that it is more long lasting because for example old people are preoccupying the Ainu movement we think that eventually these kind of movements will die out, right? So politicians will likely more likely to cater towards movement that has younger generation and that are able to have a lot of voting bases and a lot of like contribution in the end. But thirdly, we think that it is more progressive for us because we do not like younger generation do not conform in general, and they do not have like the historically been historically binded by like the political structure, so they're more likely going to like overflip the entire system, right? So we think that like they will try different methods rather than conventionally. Like for example, Malala doing something about and speaking out about the feminist movement, even though we know that like conventionally like Pakistani women not having been able to like have the vocalization because they're afraid of like incarceration, political like incarceration that will happen. Before I move on, yes.
So this is not a debate about youth activism. The motion specifically says the rise of teenagers at the forefront, which means that so just tell me, what is the difference of 25-year-old and 18-year-old being the frontier of the movement?
I think that generally like they just have like similar aligning ideologies, and younger generation in general have like more progressive ideas than older people do. Moving on to the second argument, there will be more vocalization for younger generation that have never been like historically provided. The thesis is younger people who have been historically invalidated of their actions deserve the like share of vocalization. We think that historically teenagers are barricaded from this vocalization. 3 reasons. First, they do not like previously have had the educational accessibility, especially the minority groups. But second, predominantly older people who were able to easily invalidate idea because they like so-called themselves having more experience, they like there is this like social awareness that is right now like being changed, and therefore younger generation, younger people are more likely going to speak out and to be able to invalidate the fact that like they're able to predominate the system just because they have more vocalization, right? But third, we think especially in society in Japan where like predominantly older people exist and votes, like financial decisions become barricaded. Why is this important? A, we think we're able to obtain the future vote, but B, we think age hierarchy will generally be able to gradually get disintegrated, but C, because like newer ideas will be gradually accepted through validation for other ideas, proud to oppose.
Okay, try not to see him. They probably won, maybe 2 viewers. This debate is not a hijacking of the social movement by the young. It is the collaboration of the young with the existing veterans to make for a better movement, proud to oppose. I'm going to be talking about 3 things in my speech. Firstly, on the principalistic argument that comes on like teenagers can't consent. Second, on the practical, which is better for social movements. Then finally, an extending argument if I have time. Firstly, can teenagers consent? The argumentation that comes from PM is inherently very, very flawed. So I'm going to do 4 main engagements against this argumentation. Number 1, by proposition logic, government has to regret most of the things that exist in society. Debating could be good for university, or you could be seen as overly argumentative. Coming to this competition, it could lead to more people finding out about me and therefore an invasion of privacy, or it could lead to it succeeding. Inherently, there's always going to be risk in everything. There's always perceived possible harm in everything. I don't see the uniqueness of this specific harm over anything else. Number 2, I'm going to do 2 mitigations here. Number 2, on mitigation, because you inherently opt in. Intuitively, if proposition can come up with all of these harms in 30 minutes of preparation, somebody who is deciding their entire life whether they want to become a leader of a massive social movement or not, they likely take the time to consider the possible harms and implications of their action. Third thing, another mitigation, that this is likely a gradual change, that nobody goes from a simple member of a social movement to giving a speech at the United Nations. Greta Thunberg did social media programs, YouTube videos, speeches in schools before she became the leader of the movement and before she gave a speech at the UN. Therefore, inherently, when it is a gradual movement, you can opt out at some point if you think that the perceived harm is too much. Fourth, on the flip, there is massive benefits to becoming a leader of the social movement as well. Many ideologically strong corporations likely want you, but also you show your leadership skills, you show your capacity to do things like manage individuals, you show your academic rigor. All of that is shown. Fundamentally, it is a trade-off then for these individuals, whether they want to accept the trade-off and take this harm or not. We believe that these individuals have the capacity to consent. We don't have to justify it for you. The kids can make a decision. Here comes the proposition POI. Why not 25-year-olds? I'm going to give you 4 reasons as to why 25-year-olds are not a likely alternative that we can take. Number 1, because ideas are vastly different. Mitsushi and I have vastly different ideas even though we are pretty close in age. Number 2, on shock factor. This was an unengaged argumentation that came from Ayaka's speech, that being very young, being a 16-year-old, brings you a lot more media attention than an old individual giving a speech, even if they are 25. Number 3, on learned experiences. Mitsushi didn't have an iPad from he was a kid, but I did. Number 4, on a strategic implication on opposition. If you want a 25-year-old to if you prefer a 25-year-old to be a face of the movement, then all of the Prime Minister argumentation on the possible incurred harms still exists symmetrically. If a 25-year-old wants to transfer their job, their failed social movement still stops them. Their response against me saying this in the POI was to basically concede practical and try to win on principle, that these individuals can't legally consent and therefore their consent must be invalid. 2 responses. Number 1, I think that inherently the legal consent is not necessarily a great way to determine whether an individual can consent. That is because, depending on country, depending on region, and depending on what you're consenting to, the ages vastly differ. A 13-year-old can legally consent to sexual intercourse in some countries, while some countries make it 18-year-olds. Some countries it's even 9-year-old. Just the same, for example, if I want to consent to alcohol, the age is different from when I want to drive. That inherently what this proves then, it is not necessarily age that is the determining factor in consent. It is your capacity to make consent, which differs from individual to individual. On our world then, we deem it possible for individuals to consent when we agree that they have a capacity to lead the social movement to some extent. If I'm smart enough to be able to lead a massive social movement, I'm probably smart enough to make decisions for myself. Also note here that I guess parents also are likely to intervene if it is actually so harmful. The other response I have is the fact that they're not legally franchised is the entire reason why we should be giving them a voice. These individuals don't have the capacity to do things like vote, to make their opinions heard in the public sphere, and therefore in a principle level, it is also important that we give these individuals a chance to voice out their opinion and to create practical change in society. Second question on the success of the social movement, but before that I'll take any POI.
So do you think that the political ideology that you had at the age of 16 and what you will have 10 years later is the same? Or
doesn't matter. Do you think the ideology you have at 25 is different from the ideology you have at 35? It's not a reason to restrain the rights of individuals. Let's talk about which is better for the success of a social movement then. They give you a couple layers, but the most important one is 2 things. Number 1, on the perception that the social movement incurs. The response here is very, very simple. It is not a replacement of the movement. It's either a new branch or just a new direction of the movement. So keeping this in mind, I have 2 things. First, old individuals, or the veterans, are unlikely to leave because it is not a drastic change. It is a rise that occurs over multiple years. It is a gradual change. It is Greta Thunberg going from a 13-year-old at the bottom of the social movement to now a 17-year-old leading the social movement. That happens over multiple years. It is a gradual change. It is likely a change that veterans accept. But secondly, even if you don't take that bit of analysis, the most dedicated individuals who are important to this debate, the ones who create change, the ones who vote based off of the movement, those dedicated veterans are unlikely to lead, because environmental protection is still environmental protection, whether a teen leads it or an adult leads it. Even if, at the very worst case, even if everybody all the veterans opt out of the movement, even considering our very worst case, we're willing to take the trade-off. In the long term, the teenagers who are now joining the movement, uniquely in our world, note proposition doesn't even attempt to co-opt this benefit. These individuals can create actual change in society in the future, even if it leads to a short-term decrease in capacity and power in the social movement. The second layer in argumentation that was important from A2 was the lack of know-how argument. Again, we co-opted this. Veterans stay on. Becoming the face of a movement isn't making all of the decisions for the movement. You likely work with other people to make that decision. Finally then, last 30 seconds, a very, very simple extension. We think that the teenagers have the most capacity to cater to vulnerable individuals, especially, for example, individuals who are impoverished, individuals who aren't in normal, in the white privileged areas that proposition likes to characterize. The simple reason for this is 2 things. Number 1, because teenagers have a much more capacity and incentive to be on things like social media, where impoverished individuals have a higher capacity to voice out their opinions. They may not be able to voice it out in public spheres, but social media and sensationalization allows for teens to opt in. Number 2, it is likely that teens have much less ingrained societal beliefs, especially in regards to disregarding impoverished individuals, and therefore have a higher capacity to do things like feel empathy for the impoverished individuals or other disadvantaged communities. Therefore, we believe that we also cater to the most vulnerable individuals for the success of the social movement, proud to stand on all. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Speaker Professor John Marks. And now, go quick, please. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Right, I would like to address 2 issues in my speech. First of all, the harm the young leader will experience. Is that mitigatable harm? Secondly, ability of teenage leader to influence the movement. The first issue, harm the young leaders will experience. So their main case is that they will face immense harm such as privacy violations and media bashing on SNS and so on. 3 responses. First of all, the consequence is usually opposite. Like job discrimination. No, there are some the business owner who have a strong ideology towards feminism, environmentalism, libertarianism, Republican, and so on. Therefore, these charismatic leadership and characterization are rather appreciated by a lot of companies' business owner. For example, the young feminist leader in Japan went to Chile and successfully get invested in fundraising by a lot of rich investors because her ideology was appreciated and valued. Therefore, the opposite consequence is very likely to happen. At least, at best, their case is some leaders will face some significant consequences, but it's not good enough for them to affirm the resolution. On the second level, even if that level of immense mental harm happens, the worst case scenario, those young people already suffer a lot in the status quo. They face already significant immense predicament right now. In case of women in the third world, they have fear of male violence, sexual assault every day. It's a matter of survival. 20% of women in China, in the course of their life, experience spousal abuse. The government, BNP in India, literally cares interest of cows rather than women. In these scenarios, the problem that they were talking about, like job discrimination in case of applications or the SNS bashing, is relatively smaller to the problem of survival that these women are experiencing every day. So if the parameter of their weighing is the immensity or intensity of the harm, we win that on that base. It's much better for these young people to directly vocalize their grievances as the head of movement in their course of life, rather than trying to endure the predicament every day. Thirdly, even if some people regret their political action later in their life, that problem identically applies to adult leaders aged around 25 as well. So, leader of radical communism movement in 1970s later regretted and changed their ideology. That happens to every generation, either 24, 5, or 6. So at least their harm is not mutually exclusive in this debate. So let me give you counterweight as opposed to government whip. Their worst case scenario, the privacy invasion, applies to a very small number of people because we are talking about the leader, not like regular member of a movement. Therefore, the application of the harm is very limited versus kind of the benefit we deliver, the opportunity for young people to speak out and vocalize grievances as a head of this, as the head of movement, exert large degree of influence over all same generation people in our society. The degree of the impact is much larger on the outside of us. Before moving on, I will take Yoshiban.
So in conservative context, you have very little prospect and possibility of social change. By contrast, the leader is likely going to get detained by government, potentially get assassinated. The number of impact might be low, but the immense intensity is different.
No, look at the Malala in Pakistan. She stood up for education for women. She successfully gravitated media attention all across the world and she successfully mobilized the resources to compel the government for the change. I would like to know a counterexample that disproves that. Second issue, ability of leaders, ability of teenagers. First of all, why under 20? Why under the age of consent? As they themselves have characterized, These teenagers are not franchise group. Therefore, they have literal resources to deliver their political objective. Some of them do not have a right to vote or suffragists. Therefore, being a leader is the only option or avenue for them to strongly mobilize resources and exert a level of influence over society. And therefore, and moreover, these teenagers are direct victims of dysfunctional social policies such as education, welfare, and so on. Nonetheless, they have no avenue to directly vocalize grievances. This is why we think these teenagers are entitled to this representation as the head of the movement. On the second level, their characterization is that rich, privileged family, the teenagers from rich, privileged families are likely to be the leader. Oh, well, if that is the characterization, these teenagers have good literacy of understanding the consequence of participating in the movement. They have great networks. They can rely on their rich parents for hiring consultant or lawyer to fight against job application discrimination in job hunting. Or these rich kids can be introduced a lot of resources such as marketer, consultant, lawyer to present their activity in a ways in which people consider to be persuasive. So it's easy for these rich kids to access better training program to give a good answers in interview and so on. So all the harm presented by the other side of the house is mitigated if we buy the characterization that these teenagers are from privileged families in our society. Moreover, their overgeneralization is that these teenagers cannot give nuanced explanations about agenda in media interview. I think that's the matter of intelligence, not the matter of age. Moreover, the most authoritative figurehead sometimes misunderstands the reality of the problem that a lot of people are facing in the status quo. For example, Andrea Dworkin, the most authoritative feminist figurehead, demonized men, and she said that marriage is a legalization of rape. And that perception is dramatically antithetical to what vast majority of people in our society have. As opposed to that, Emma Watson's People She speech, she explained that men are also victims of gender stereotype. Men are also victims of a patriarchal society. And this narrative and message is far more likely to be appreciated by a lot of people in our society because that projects the reality of ways in which we understand the social problem. The only response from Yoshipan, government whip, is that veterans have an incentive to study and update their analysis and perception. No, this debate is about how people perceive the public figurehead. So the perception that young people themselves vocalizing grievances has different degree of implication for people in the same generation. This catharsis is what motivates people to support and give resources to enhance the movement. We are happy to oppose. Thank you.
Capacity for these young children to make decisions. It is about whether this movement is perceived as an old movement dominated by rich old white men, or if it is perceived as a progressive movement that can cater to the needs and necessities of a new generation. On our side, we stand for a movement where the individuals in the face of the social movement are individuals who the next generation that targets the next generation. I'm going to talk about two things. First, on consent, then on social movement success. First, on consent. Aside from the fact that consent is very arbitrary in this debate, insofar as the age of consent is also very arbitrary in society, we have three mitigations. We tell you, number one, that you intuitively opt in and consider the harms before you opt in, that you are taking a trade-off consciously. Number two, that this is inherently a very gradual change. You don't leapfrog into the top generations. Even their characterization concedes this. And number three, from Mitsushi, we tell you that the harm is already big right now for the majority of the individuals. We tell you that individuals are often disenfranchised in the status quo, that we would rather that these individuals get a voice. We also make two different strategic considerations here. Number one, that it is an intuitive trade-off for a lot of these individuals to take the trade-off of a decrease in privacy for the massive benefits that can incur to their lives, not just in job prospects, but also changing their entire livelihoods in the case of repressed individuals in some conservative countries. The second strategic consideration was that literally, this is not at all unique. This matter of consent leading to some harm is not unique to you being young. In the future, you can still make bad decisions. In the future, your political ideologies can still change. You being a child is not a justification for your voice to be silenced. With that said then, social movement success. And under this, I want to talk about two different ways in which we win. Number one, that the voices of the young are very important. And number two, the structural change that the young can bring are very important. Number one, the voices of the young are very, very important. The entire proposition analysis is basically, well, these people can't legally consent, and these people don't have the capacity to do things like vote, therefore they shouldn't be in the social movement, or shouldn't lead a social movement. This is categorically the reason why we support these individuals being in the social movement in the first place, right? We want these disenfranchised individuals to get a voice. Look at their rhetoric. Their rhetoric is, oh, these individuals' ideals are going to change from when you're 16 to 26. That doesn't negate the harm that you not catering to the 16-year-old has. Just because your ideal from when you're 16 changes when you're 26 doesn't mean that your ideas when you're 16 are not correct. When you change, when the environment you live in changes, obviously your ideologies and the beliefs that you have change. But there still exist individuals who are still young, who still have strong beliefs, and who are still harmed on proposition that we must cater to. Secondly, they tell you about all the structural reasons why it is likely that these individuals' voices can be heard. But at the same time, in the same breath, they claim that, well, there exists an age hierarchy, right? They need to stick with a characterization. If there is an age hierarchy, these young individuals can't voice out. If there is no age hierarchy and you can cater to these young individuals, then wouldn't the leaders feel some kind of pressure or whatever else mechanism that proposition brings you? I don't think that they can argue two mutually exclusive characterizations. The second reason why the young are important for the social movement was that the structural change that they can bring, which largely remains unengaged, coming from Ayaka's speech. We give you three importances. Number one, that the same old is no change. For decades, social movements have existed where old individuals have been the leaders. We need new change to keep up with the innovation of society. Secondly, the only way we can get massive politician incentive to invest in new areas of the social movement is if we get increased numbers of individuals opting in. Sure, old people opt in, important, but future voter base, even more important. We're willing to trade this off. And third and finally, these individuals are progressive. They can push through historic conventions that exist. We think that this is also a unique reason why this structural change is only possible by the young. For society, oppose.